Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Dalid. Today is October 7th. It's hard to believe it's been a year since this tragic day. Sadly, we are still grappling with its aftermath. We continue to pray for the release of all the hostages, for the safety of the soldiers on the front lines, for the safe return of all those displaced from their homes, for the full recovery of injured soldiers, and comfort for those mourning the loss of close family or friends. We also pray for the safety of those living under constant rocket attacks, as we even heard just before class this morning. And the list goes on. May this year bring peace and better days for Am Yisrael. Okay, we're going to get started with a review of the Mishnah from Daf Kuf Gimel. And I made some pictures which will help you to understand all the mathematics of it. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and we will look at the pictures. So, well, actually, before we look at the pictures for a quick minute, let's just talk about the two cases the Mishnah discussed. The Mishnah discussed that you sold a bait core of a fowl. That means a field or an area that could be used as a field. That is 30 se'ah. Okay, we're going to talk about all these amounts. But you said either midah bechevel, exact measurements, or you said hein chaser hein yeter, which, more or less, give or take. So if you said midah bechevel, as measured by the rope, which is what they use to measure things, we learned that if you remember with the Tchum Shabbat, they would measure it with this rope, or we learned it with all different situations. I think Egla Rufa also. If there's any discrepancy whatsoever, it goes back. Okay, so if I, as a buyer, got too much land, if the seller said midah bechevel, exact measurements, we return any extra. But, and that's the case we're going to mostly deal with, if we said hein chaser hein yeter, give or take, more or less, then we assume there's a certain amount, what we call the margin of error, that basically I get to keep, okay? Or if I got too little, then I can't really complain about. So what is that amount? Okay, so for here, we're going to look at the pictures. The amount we said is a quarter kav per se'ah. That's the amount. So let's talk about the se'ah and kav because those are two different measurements. So there's 6 kav in a se'ah. So what I did here is I made these 6 boxes, which basically shows 1 se'ah equals 6 kav. So this box is 1 se'ah, which is 6 kav. What I did in the picture on the left is I divided those 6 boxes, each one into quarters, because we really want a quarter kav. So each kav within the se'ah is now into 4s. So what I did is in yellow, I did one of the quarter of one of the kavim that are in these 6 kavim, which make up the se'ah, which basically means we have 24 quarters in that box. It's very simple if you look at the picture now, because each se'ah has 6 kav, and each kav has 4 quarters. So 4 times 6 is 24. And if we take a quarter, 1 quarter kav out of that, that's 1 in 24. And that's the amount that the Mishnah gives. Afilu pichet rova l'se'ah or hotir rova l'se'ah higio. That's the margin of error that we accept. We assume it means that whoever buys or sells gives up on this amount, up to and including a quarter kav for every se'ah. So now if we move to a field that's a core, which is the bottom picture, okay, what I did here is each box here is basically like one of these boxes of a se'ah. Okay, right? These boxes above are se'ot, and this little yellow over here is 1 in 24 of that whole big box. So what I did here is I did it in red just so it's more noticeable. Each box of these 30 boxes, we have 30 boxes because one core is 30 se'ot. Each box is a se'ah, and each red dot is 1/24th. Okay, I can't say it's exactly to scale, but I tried to make it look like 1/24 is a little teeny corner of that. So if we have in each, okay, again, this doesn't have to be in each one exactly. It's not like you take the field and put it into boxes, but the amount basically we have 30 of these little red dots, 1/24th of every se'ah in this field. If we took all those quarters and we added them up, you would get to 1 quarter times 30 because there's a quarter kav in each of these se'ot that we can assume margin of error. We multiply a quarter by 30, you get to 7.5. And that's how the Mishnah gets this number, 7.5 kavim. So up to 7.5 kav in a field that's 30 se'ah, that's what we assume that each side gives up on. Okay, those are the basic numbers you have to know. There's one other very important number, which is, so now let's assume I bought this field and you gave me that amount extra or that amount less. Okay, so if we take all those red dots and we stick them together, that's a clump of land. So if it's that amount, and let's say it's in addition to the core, or it's less than the core, then we assume that we're both okay with that. Okay, either that way or that way, one of us, right? The seller's okay if the seller gave me too much. I'm okay as the buyer if I got that amount less. But more than that, now the main case we're going to talk about is if I got more land than that, then we give it back. And what did we say? We give it all back. Okay, so basically up to that extra amount I got in addition, up to 7.5 kav, we basically assume I get to keep. If I go over and I get to 7.6 or 8 kav, let's say, then I have to give it all back. But there's a problem because between 7.6 and 9 kav, you have nothing to do with that land. Okay? So I can't give you back the land because it's not a significant piece of land. That was what the Mishna said. So I can't give you back that land. What do we do then? I pay you for it. Okay, because I paid you for a core. I didn't pay you for the extra 8 kabim. So now I have to pay you for the extra 8 kabim. Now, even though at 7.5 you were okay with it, as soon as we get beyond the 7.5, then we assume there's no mechila at all. You're not mochel on 7.5, but not on the extra half kav. No. Once you go over, it's like going bust, and right, I have to pay the entire amount. And that's what the Mishnah had basically set up. So now I need to basically give back the surplus, only the surplus. All the 8 kabim now, assuming it's 8 kabim, let's say, I have to give back all 8 kav. I keep the field, I give back the surplus. Now the question is, what if it's 9 kav? Once we get to 9 kav, no, I have to give back all 9 kav. But normally we'd say I have to pay. And what we learned in the Mishnah is the seller can insist I pay because the seller can really decide if the seller wants a little piece of land, let them take it. But when we get to 9 kav, that's already a minimum size of a field. So I, as the buyer, can say, take back the field. Okay, I don't have to pay. Okay, so between 7.6 and 9, okay, again, this is all assuming the field is a core. Okay, that's our measurements. So between because 7.5 is the relevant number for a core. It would be 15, let's say, if it's 2 core. It would be half that amount if it's half, okay, a core. So now, up to 7.5 for the core, everything stays the same, nothing happens. 7.6, I have to pay, unless the seller says I want the land back. But if the seller doesn't want the land back, I have to pay the 7.6 or the 8 or the 8.5. When it gets to 9, though, if we measure it and we find out that I got 9 kav extra, then the 9 kav I can give you back as land, okay? Or if it's a gina, if it's a garden, chatzi kav or rova kav, depending on the machloket and what you think the minimum size of a garden is. Okay, a garden is more like a field is where you can plant grains, and because there's no water flowing through, if there's a lot of water flowing through, then already you can plant like a garden, which could be trees, like an orchard, something like that. So the size there is different because, first of all, trees, right? You can get a lot more in a smaller amount of space, and therefore it's a different measurement. But then I can insist on giving it back to you. That's basically the Mishnah. So the Gemara starts off with a very kind of easy question or basic question, which is, the Mishnah gave 2 cases. Either I said, mida b'chevel, measuring, or you said, because I was the buyer, the seller said, I'm selling you a field and I'm measuring it out exactly, or they said more or less. And there was a different halacha for each one. But what if Ibaile bait kor stamamai? What if we just said bait kor? What about if I didn't say mida b'chevel, or I didn't say hen chaserin yeter? You just said, as the seller, I'm selling you a bait kor. What do we do? Is it like hen chaserin yeter? Do we assume you meant more or less? Or do we assume you meant exact measurement? So the Gemara is going to do a very classic, this is a very typical thing we see a lot, where they're going to say, oh, well, first case in the Mishnah said only midah b'chevel. So you can assume stam would be the opposite. But then they're going to say, what about the second case? You can infer the opposite of that. And then they're going to say, okay, obviously you can't conclude anything from the language of the Mishnah. So let's see. Tashma. Beit kor afar ani mocher lecha. Mida bechevel. I'm selling you a beit kor of afar, measured out exactly. And then there's no error, no nothing. Any bit of discrepancy goes back. Or again, in this case, the buyer would have to spend the money, pay the money to the seller for it, unless it's up to 9 kaf. Pachot koshu yinakeh, yeter koshu yachzir, right? If he gets a little less, the seller has to give him that extra amount. If she gets a little more, the buyer has to give back that little amount extra. Hasta, or again, has to pay for it. Hastama, well, from there, what can you infer? That if you didn't say anything, you just said beit kor, then hein chaser hein yeter dami. Only if it's midah bechevel are we so exacting. If you didn't say I'm exacting, then obviously you wouldn't be. And that sounds reasonable. But the problem is the next line. But then Gemara contradicts this reasoning and says from the next line, you can actually infer the opposite. Because the next line says, hein chaser hein yeter, afilu pichei rova l'se'ah u'tir rova l'se'ah yigio. Hastama k'midah bechevel dami. The next case said, well, there's a margin of error if you said more or less, which sounds like if you didn't say anything, well, then there is no margin of error. So, therefore, from the two cases brought in the Mishnah, which each one was very particular, you can't infer anything about a case where you weren't particular in your language. We have no idea. So, attempt number 1 fails. Next attempt. Braita, Tashma. Let's learn it from this braita. This braita is going to list 3 cases, and it's going to be very clear what the halacha is in a stam case, because the first case in this braita is a stam case, where you didn't say anything other than beit kor afal. Beit kor afal ani mocher lecha. I'm selling you a field the size of a beit kor, which is the case we're looking for. You didn't say midah bechevel, you didn't say more or less. Case 2, kid beit kor afar ani mocher lecha. About a beit kor, okay, like a beit kor, which sounds like give or take. Hein chaser hein yeter ani mocher lecha. Case 3, more or less. Afilu pichei rova l'se'ah u'tir rova l'se'ah yigio. And what do we say? If you're a little more, a little less, right? Meaning up to a quarter kav per se'ah, you got extra or got less. We leave it. Okay, there you have the halacha. Stam beit kor. You say beit kor afar ani mocher lecha without specifying anything. It's just like hein chaser hein yeter, and that's what the Gemara is going to conclude right now. Alma stam enami kehein chaser hein yeter dami. It must be more similar to that case, as is explained in this braita. To which the Gemara tries to reject this proof, but in the end they're going to accept it. The Gemara suggests maybe we misread the braita. Hatam perusha kamefarish. Maybe it's really the 3 cases aren't 3 cases. We thought it was 3 cases: beit kor afal, kibeit kor afal, and hein chaser hein yeter. But maybe it's perusha kamefarish. It's all coming to define each other, meaning what? Ezehu beit kor shehi kibeit kor. When do you have a sale of a beit kor where it's like a sale of approximately a beit kor? Kigon de amar lehein chaser hein yeter. And then case number 1 and case number 2 are actually not cases at all. It's beit kor afar ani mocher lecha. In what case would it be kid beit kor afar, which we saw was case number 2? What case would it be like a beit kor, meaning it's not exactly exact? If you said the words hein chaser hein yeter, and then it actually would imply that if you said stam, it wouldn't be the case. Okay, and then that wouldn't teach us anything. But matkefla Rashi says you can't possibly read the braita that way, because look at the language of the braita. In ken ani mocher lecha ani mocher lecha lamali. If you want to say that what it was really saying, when is a beit kor like a kid beit kor, when you say the words hein chaser hein yeter, then it shouldn't have said, let's look at the words again, beit kor afal ani mocher lecha. Okay, the first case is a beit kor afal, I am selling you. Kid beit kor afal ani mocher lecha. Or you said, like a beit kor, I am selling you. In other words, if all this was one case, you wouldn't say each time, I am selling you, I am selling you. It really makes it sound like it's a quote from the mouth of the seller, and it's giving 3 different languages of, if you say, I'm selling you this, if you say, I'm selling you that, if you say, I'm selling you that. in which case it clearly is three cases, and therefore Shma Mina, Elalav Shma Mina. Therefore, the only way to really read this is to conclude that Stama Nami Kehin Chaser Hein Yeter Dami Shma Mina. So from here we can basically conclude that it's Hein Chaser Hein Yeter and Stam are all the same. If you just said it's Stam, you didn't say anything, we assume you meant more or less, which if I had asked you in the beginning, you probably would have answered that that was the case, because it makes sense, right? Midah b'chevel is when you said I'm being exacting. Otherwise, we assume there's a certain amount of mechila, as we call it, where each side said, oh, okay, I assume there's going to be a bit of an error, a bit of a differential here, and I'm okay with that. Ma'u machzir lo ma'ot. Now we're going to go to the line, and this is why I reviewed the entire Mishnah before, because we're going to really delve into each part of the Mishnah. What did we learn? That when it's between 7.6, you've already gone over the margin of error number, and you have to return all the surplus. You, between 7.5, again, assuming we're in a bait course, 7.5 to 9, kav, you can't, if you're this buyer, you can't return the land because the seller has nothing to do with that land. And the Mishnah said it's liapot kocho shel mocher, right? It's to strengthen, right? Lama amru machzir lo ma'ot. Why does it say you have to then, the buyer has to pay the extra money? So basically, I bought a bait core, but I ended up with a bait core plus 8 extra kav. I have to pay the money for those 8 extra kav. And I don't have a choice in the matter. The only way I don't have to return it is if the seller says I want it back. But otherwise, I can't return it. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute. We only say that the mocher has the upper hand, the seller, and not the buyer. But wait, we're going to see a braita where it seems that the choice of whether to buy or either pay for it or return the land is actually up to the seller, the buyer. How do we see this? V'hatanya, the opposite of the Mishnah. Hatanya pichit shiv'at kabim v'mechza lekor. That's our margin of error. If you got 7.5 kav less per core, or hutir shiv'at kabim v'mechza lekor, or you got 7.5 more than you should have. Higi the sale is good and nothing happens. This is all what we've learned. But here, look at the language. Yoter mikam. But if you veered from that, it was too much surplus or too little. But we're going to focus on I, as the buyer, got too much. Kofin et hamocher linkor. I can force the seller. Okay, you already see the language. I have the upper hand. I can force the seller to sell me that extra land. In other words, if the seller says, I want the land back, and I say, I want to keep it, I'm allowed to. So what do you see here? I have the upper hand. And there could be cases where we force the buyer to buy. Okay, but you see for sure here that the buyer has the upper hand and can force the seller to sell. So how can we explain that? So that seems to clearly contradict the Mishnah, because the Mishnah said it's all up to the seller. And this braita says it's up to the buyer and the seller, theoretically. The buyer has the power to force the seller's hand. To which the Gemara says, well, we're going to do what we call an ukimta. We're going to say that braita is only in a unique situation, and it's not really talking about what you think. Okay, in the end, only the seller can decide if the seller wants to get the land back. Normally, the seller's not going to want the land back. Again, we're talking about this in between 7.5 to 9, where it's not actually a whole field. So the seller has the right to say, I insist that you buy it. I don't want this extra land back. But what is the buyer then? When it said that the buyer can force the seller to sell, what does it mean? Well, let's understand first the situation, and then we'll see what it means. Hatam kigon to have a yekira meikara v'zal mehasha. This could sound a lot like Bava Metzia. All of a sudden, there was a price change. Okay, what happened? The land, at the time I bought the land was expensive. But when we measured and we realized that there was a surplus, and now I'm forced to buy, you're going to force me to buy that extra piece of land, the price of land has already gone down. So what does it mean? Kofin et hamocher linkol. It doesn't mean I can force the seller to sell it to me if the seller doesn't want to. I don't have that power. The seller decides what they want to do with the land. Do they want it back or do they want to sell it? But I can force them to take the lower price of now and not have to pay the higher price it was at the time of the sale. Damrinamle, I can say to you, if you're going to give me land and make me keep this land, I'm only willing to pay the lower price as it is now. So that's basically the way we resolve the contradiction between the braita and the Mishnah. The braita is not actually saying that that the buyer has the upper hand in general to decide whether to buy or whether to return the land or whether to buy it, but the seller can decide that. But if the seller is forcing the buyer to buy, the buyer can, if the price has changed and the price is now lower, the buyer can insist on paying the lower price, and in that element only, the buyer has the upper hand. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. The buyer can lock into the price it is now if the price went down, but wait, and doesn't have to pay the original price. But it says in a different braita that when the buyer pays, the buyer has to pay the price it was at the time of the sale. That seems to totally contradict what we just explained this braita as being. So as saying, to which the Gemara says, oh no, Hatam, that was talking about a different case. This is again another Ukimta. That braita was talking about Kigon to have a Zolami Yakar Hashta. That's talking about the reverse case, when the price was lower in the beginning and now went up. At the time we measured and realized there was a surplus, the price is already higher, then the buyer can insist on the earlier price. So what do you see here? In the end, the conclusion is not only, okay, the buyer doesn't have the upper hand when it comes to deciding whether to buy or whether to return the land, that the seller, but the buyer has the upper hand in any type of price fluctuation. If the price went down, then the buyer can say, I'm only giving you the price at the current price. If the price went up, then the buyer could say, I'm only giving you the price it was at the time of the sale. So in terms of what the buyer has to pay, the buyer has the upper hand. But whether or not the buyer can pay or return the extra property, that the buyer has no rights to, unless, and that's going to lead us to the next line, unless it's already 9 kav. Once it gets to 9 kav, and that's the law we saw in the Mishnah, then the buyer can say, I'm giving you back the land if the buyer wants. The buyer doesn't have to pay for it because it's already useful for the seller. And that's the next line. Shem Shiur basadeh. We're now just going back to that line in the Mishnah. Shiur basadeh beit tisha kabin. Right? Then already they can buy. Now, before we start on the Gemara on this, I'm going to point out the way we've been learning this and say that perhaps we're going to learn it a little differently. Now, we keep assuming that we're talking about a field that's a beit core. So if we go back to our pictures, okay, I'll bring them up for another second. This wasn't 100% clear. So our pictures, we're talking about a field of 30 core at 7.5 kav, which is basically all these red dots together, right? 30 times a quarter is 7.5. At 7.5 kav, up to and including 7.5 kav, we assume there was mechila, give in. Once you get beyond 7.5 kav, we assume there's no mechila, that's called surplus. All of that theoretically goes back to the seller, but it doesn't go back because the seller can say, I don't want it back, just pay me the extra money. Okay, and the seller has to pay the extra money. Once you hit 9 kav, so between 7.6 and 9, the seller has the upper hand to say, I don't want the land back, pay me the money. Once you get to 9, okay, once you're at 9, then obviously what happens? That's already a field, and then we can insist, right? The buyer wants to return it and doesn't want to buy it. They can say, take it back. This is a field. But now we're going to have a big debate, Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, about whether, and I'll tell you in very simple terms, whether this number 9 kav in the Mishnah is an absolute number. No one gives in at 9 kav. No one is mochel, a field that's 9 kav, even if it's in a gigantic field, right? Now, we assume 9 kav is 9 kav if you're talking about a field of a core. What if it's 2 kolim? What if it's double the size? Now, with double the size, okay, if you look back at that picture, okay, you can imagine, it's just a little easier to imagine. I didn't write this out, but imagine the field was double the size. Now, if we add to the 7.5 and we get up to 9, you're not at a quarter kav per se'ah, right? You're obviously not, because a quarter kav per se'ah, right? You're going to have to be 15 kav is going to have to be your margin of error here. So if you're at 9 kav, what will we say? You don't return it, you don't do anything because it's part of, right? So if this field were double the size, you would think that at 9 kav, the buyer doesn't return it. The buyer gets to keep it because there's din of mechila, because proportionally, right, there's mechila. But Rav Huna doesn't view it that way. Rav Huna says 9 kav is an absolute number. Even if it's a huge field, it could be 10 kolim of field, it doesn't matter. if you gave 9 extra kav, nobody gives up on 9 extra kav. And that's what we're going to read right now. Even in a gigantic field, it doesn't matter. As soon as the margin of error is a quarter kav per tse'ah, up until 9 kav. Once you hit 9 kav, the quarter kav per tse'ah is an irrelevant fraction or an irrelevant proportion. We don't care anymore. 9 kav is a serious amount in any field. And therefore, it stands on its own. It's an absolute number. So it's proportional up until you get to 9 kav. That's the idea. It's proportional till 9 kav. Once you get to 9 kav, that's such a significant amount, nobody would throw in an extra 9 kav without, by accident. On purpose. And no one's willing to be mochel on that amount. That's Rav Huna. Rav Nachman goes back to what we thought originally, which is it's all proportional. Rav Nachman says, Notain shiva kabim v'mechza l'kol kor v'kol. It's 7.5 per core. So double that, double core, it's going to have to be 15. So at 15.5 or 15.1, the seller can say, I'm giving you back this 15.1 kav field. But under 15, you can't return it. You don't need to return it, actually. The buyer wins out. The buyer gets this extra 15 kav because that's all within the amount we assume a seller is mochen. So this is a very interesting debate, and you can understand why there would be such a debate because it's really an interesting concept, which is it all proportional and keeps going up and up and up and up, or is there a cutoff? Is there a cutoff where we say, that's huge, right? I'm not going to give you something huge by accident. So that's the debate here. So let's keep reading Rav Nachman, turning now to Amud Bet. So he says, you get sheva kavim v'mechza for each core. V'yi kamilti yetera l'tishat kabin hadre. And if when you do it all proportionally, you're beyond the margin of error and you've reached 9 kav, you need 2 things. You need to be beyond the margin of error, and which is that proportion, and get up to 9 kav. Then the buyer can insist on returning the piece of land. So ATB Rava Rav Nachman. Rav is going to bring 3 difficulties on Rav Nachman from our Mishna, which we're going to easily resolve. He says, look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, She'im shiur basadeh beit tisha kabin. It said, if you have, right, you give an extra 9 kav, and it didn't say in what size field. So comes Rava and assumes, lav dezabin le korayim, sounds like 9 kav is the magic number. Should be irrelevant whether it's a core or kurayim. Kurayim is 2 core, right? Whether it's 2 core, it sounds like 9 kav is your number, no matter what the size of the field is. To which Rav Nachman simply answers, no, dezabin like core. No, what do you mean? First of all, Rav Nachman has good reason to say so, because the Mishnah was talking about a beit core afal, right? So Rav Nachman says the Mishnah meant 9 kav when the field is a core. When the field is 2 korim, it'll be 15 and a bit, right? So that doesn't really contradict. Now we're going to do the same thing with the next 2 cases in the Mishnah. If you remember, the Mishnah set up, if it's a field, it's a beit core. It's 9 kav. That's the cutoff where it's already significant. If it's a gina, garden, then it's going to be either half a kav, half a kav, or a quarter kav. So the Gemara is going to also assume they're going to try to do the same proportion here. When Rava asks this question, it says ubigina beit chatzi kav lav dezabin le sa'atayim. Again, the Rava is going to assume they must mean, right, even if it's not, right, that it's the simple reading. It's actually hard to understand what the simple reading is. But it sounds like once it's a chatzi kav, a half a kav, it doesn't matter if the field doesn't matter what size the field is. So he says, isn't it, let's say, in 2 se'ah? Now, what's the proportion? Okay, let's just go back to our picture for a minute. Okay, this is actually pretty easy. If it's a quarter kav for 1 se'ah, right, which is this 1 in 24, then and that we say there's still mechila, right? That's an amount that we let go. And a half a kav, if you give a half a kav extra when you were selling a gina, out of what's Rava assuming? 2 se'ah. Now, half a kav, quarter kav for 1 se'ah, double a quarter and double 1, you get to a half a kav for 2 se'ah. So half a kav or 2 se'ah would be this exact same proportion, 1 in 24. And according to this, what will we say? That would be mechila. You wouldn't give it back. And what does it say here? When it's beichatzi kav, you give it back. So it seems to imply that it's all an absolute number. As long as it's a chatzi kav and it has significance, you have to give it back. To which they say, why are you saying this is within the margin of error? Why don't you just assume, lo, dezabin le se'ah. The sale was for a se'ah. Half a kav out of a se'ah, that's already, right, 1 in 12, not 1 in 24. In which case, well, that's obviously beyond the margin of error. And then it's all proportional, and that's how Rav Nachman explains his relative argument. That's all according to the proportion. Well, last question, which is going to be the same type question. Uchidivri Rabbi Akiva beit rova. Now, a quarter se'ah, according to Rabbi Akiva, if you've erred a quarter se'ah, since a quarter se'ah in a garden is already, according to Rabbi Akiva, considered a garden, you can return that whole quarter se'ah. Now, quarter se'ah would be, right, we're going to assume my lav dezabin le se'ah. Rava says it must be a quarter kav of error in a field that was sold that you sold a se'ah, or a garden that you sold a se'ah's worth of. Now, a quarter kav per se'ah, that's our measurement that we say was within the margin of error. It's the exact border, but it's within the margin of error. And yet, what does the Mishnah say? You can return it. Sounds like it's an absolute number. To which, again, lo dezabin le chatzi se'ah. Now, you could say it's a quarter kav if the whole sale was about half a se'ah. In other words, each time you just find a proportion that works where this will be beyond the margin of error. And this will be, a major surplus that the buyer got, that we can make then the buyer can say, look, I'm returning this because, again, the amount of error was proportional beyond the margin of error, and it's the minimum amount for a garden, so you can actually return it. And therefore, we end up with no real question on Rav Nachman. Both of them could be read into the Mishnah. So again, is it absolute number, this 9 kav, or chatzi kav, or reva kav for the garden, or is it a relative number? And again, you're only going to be able to return it if it's beyond the margin of error of the quarter kav per se'ah proportion. By Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi asks another question. Now, we said that in a field, you can return it if you've gotten to 9 kav. But if it's a garden, you can return it already at a half a kav or a quarter kav, depending on whether you're Rabbi Akiva or not, or you hold by Rabbi Akiva or not. But what if, Rav Ashi asks, Sadevina Seit Gina, what if when I bought it, it was a field? But then it became potentially used as a garden, okay? Once we realize that there's too much there, there's a surplus, and we've gotten beyond the amount that's a surplus, and now I want to return it to you, and let's say we're at 8.5 kav, okay, or 8 kav. So if it's a field, I can't insist on returning it to you. I have to pay the extra money. But if now, when we realize that I got 8 kav extra, it now potentially could be used as a garden. What's the difference? Well, let's say all of a sudden a river started flowing through. The river overflowed and now goes through my space, this field. So now it actually could be used as a garden because it has a source of water there. Since that's the case, Rav Ashi wants to know, well, now that it's 8 kav of surplus, if it's a garden, that's already, I can return it to you because it could be used as a garden for you. And that already has significance because even at a half a kav, it could be used as a garden. So for sure, 8 kav. Or ginav naset sademai. Or what if it's the reverse? What if it was a garden first? And then, right, I could return you any little amount, but then the riverbed dried up. And now it has no water source and it can only be used as a field. So if I return it to you, let's say it was 5 kav, I return it to you, but right, for a garden, that was within the amount, because more than a half a kav or more than a quarter kav. But as a field, it's useless. And now it happens to be a field. But at the time of the sale, it was a garden. So what do we go by? The time, right, from the original or from now? And the answer is Teku. We don't have an answer to that question. Okay, no one knows the answer to Rav Ashi's question. And moving on. Another issue. Now, well, we said that if it's between 7.5 kav and 9, let's just assume we're talking about a bait core. Between 7.5 and 9, I can't, or between 7.6, basically there's a surplus. I have to pay the money. I can't return you the field because what are you going to do with it? There's one exception to that rule. which is Tana, the braita says, Imayas samuch l'sadeu afilu koshu machzir lo karka. If it was next to your field, even a little small amount I can return to you, because if, let's say, you sold me the adjacent field. So now if I want to return you something, you live right next door. So basically, I can give you back a little portion because it'll be attached to your field and it'll just make your field a little bigger. The whole problem is, what are you going to do with a little piece of land that's useless? But if I'm giving you back, now this word kosher is a little confusing because it's not any little amount. It has to be more than 7.5 core. If it's not more than 7.5, I'm sorry, kav. If it's not more than 7.5 kav, then basically we assumed you were giving it to me, and that was okay. That was margin of error. We're talking here, though, once it's beyond 7.5 kav, it doesn't matter if it's 7.6, if it's 7.8, if it's right, any amount, even if it's less than 9, that's the main thing, you have what to do with, because it's just attached to your field, and you'll plow it along with your field and all that. And therefore, I can actually return it to you. And I can insist that I don't want to buy it. I'm just going to give it back to you. Now, again, Rav Ashi asks a question, which we're not going to have an answer to. By Rav Ashi, bor ma'u shetafsik, amat hamayim ma'u shetafsik, derech harabim ma'u shetafsik, and richba dedikla ma'u shetafsik. Well, we said that if it's next to your field, I can return it to you because you can plow it along with your field. So what if there's a separation between your field? It's right next to your field, but there happens to be a pit in between this piece of land I want to return you and your field. Or more bothersome than a pit is an amat hamayim, a water channel. Or even more bothersome than that, a derech harabim, there's a public path that people walk through. And they say it's not really reshut harabim, that for sure would be a separation, but it's a path that's wide like reshut harabim and people pass through. Or there's a row of palm trees. And that's separating this land from your land. Would we say then that that's adjacent or not? Is that considered enough of a separation to say, no, it's really wholly inconvenient for you to get this little piece of land on the other side of the pit or on the other side of the road? And the Gemara answers, we don't have an answer to this question. Okay, two last things to finish up for today. One is this last line in the Mishna, which we said was a little confusing and didn't make sense. Once you get past the 7.5 kav per se'ah, lo et harova bilva machzir, you don't just return the quarter kav extra, ela kol hamotar, but all the surplus. Now it's a little bit klape laya. This sounds the opposite. You weren't returning the quarters, you were returning the surplus, the extra, the 0.1, right? Let's say you're at 7.6. So the 0.1 is the surplus. All the rivaim is the 7.5 until that point. It doesn't make sense. Don't return only the 7.5, also the surplus. It should be the reverse. To which Tani Ravin bar Rav Nachman, Ravin reads the Mishnah differently and says, no, there's a mistake here. Lo et hamotar bilvad machzir. You don't only return the surplus. What's beyond the 7.5, ela et kol rivaim kulam. You return all the quarter kavs of error that were before that we said was kind of just okay, and the seller said, I don't care about them. But once you go over, you return everything. And this was the part of the sugya that we quoted back on, I'll see it around Sadi Dalet Amabet, where we were talking about what we assume when I buy something, I accept certain psolet, the garbage, extras or bad stuff. I accept a certain amount, right? But once you go over that amount, then basically it all gets returned. So likewise here. Okay, now we're going to start a new Mishnah, and we'll learn the Mishnah for today, and tomorrow we'll really deal with it and delve into it in the Gemara. Midah b'chevel ani mocher lecha, just like the case we just saw. The seller says, I'm selling it to you exact measurement. Hein chaser, hein yeter, more or less. It is a very confusing thing. This is like, which way do you go? And you point, in both directions, right? Which way am I supposed to go? So, I'm selling you an exact measurement. I'm selling it to you more or less. Batel hein chaser, hein yeter midah b'chevel. Your last words you said, hein chaser, hein yeter, that basically overrides the first words you said. And this sounds similar to things we learned in the past, which is if you say something, we learned it in Nedarim, and it probably came up, I don't remember, but probably Nazir and all these cases where you use two different, you say something and then you say something contradictory, which one do we take? So according to the Mishnah, hein chaser hein yeter cancels out midah b'chevel. The assumption is what? That when you said the second phrase, you kind of changed your mind about what you said in the beginning. First, you said, I'm going to measure it exactly. And then you said, you know what? We'll do more or less. And likewise, hein chaser hein yeter. This has something to do with which one you said first. If you started with the more or less, and then you said midah b'chevel, I'm going to measure it out with a rope. Batil midah b'chevel hein chaser hein yeter. We go by again. The last thing you said nullifies the first thing you said, and therefore we're going to go with midah b'chevel. Divrei ben nanas. This is what ben nanas holds. The Mishnah brings one opinion, but we'll see immediately in the Gemara tomorrow that the rabbis disagree with ben nanas, and we'll get to that in tomorrow's daf. So what did we do today? We talked about the difference between midah b'chevel and hin chaser hin yeter, which we also ended with, although there we were really just dealing with contradictory statements that you made and which one we go by, the first thing you said or the second. But the difference is that there's no error, no assumption, no leeway for a margin of error in the case of midah b'chevel, rather than the case of more or less, where we assume a margin of error. What's the margin of error? Quarter kav per se'ah, which goes to, if it's a beit core, 7.5 kav. At that amount, nothing happens. Above that, until you get to 9 kav, we say the buyer has to pay the money for the entire amount of the surplus. Once you get to 9 kav, the buyer can return the land. In the first case, 7.6 or 7.51 to 9, the seller can decide if to get the land back or if to sell. But it's all, or if to make the buyer buy it. But beyond that, the buyer can insist, take back the land, because that's already a significant piece of land. And then we saw the amount also for a garden, also for that. And then we got into number one. What about a case stam where you didn't say midah b'chevel and you didn't say you didn't say midah b'chevel, you didn't say more or less. And then we said it's really like more or less. And then we got to, are we always giving the power to the buyer, to the seller? Didn't we say that right between 7.5 and 9 that the seller can decide? What about this Mishnah that seems to, the braita that seems to imply the buyer can decide? To which you said no, the buyer can't decide whether to buy or sell. The buyer or return the land, to buy or return the land, but the buyer can decide on the price if there was a price fluctuation. That was how we reconciled the problem with the braita. Then we got to the big machloket, Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Very interesting about this 9 kav. Is it relative or absolute? We brought 3 difficulties with Rav Nachman, who said it was relative from the Mishnah itself, but we resolved all the contradictions. It wasn't such clear There weren't such clear contradictions. Then we had Rav Ashi, who asked this question: what if a sadeh turned to a ginah and a ginah turned to a sadeh by the time you realize there was a surplus? Does that change things or not in terms of this amount that the buyer can insist on returning you the property? We didn't have an answer. Then we said you can return it if it's adjacent. But again, Rav Ashi asked some questions. What if there was something blocking, like a pit or a bunch of other things? Then we fixed that line, that last line in the Mishnah, which really seemed to be opposite of what it said, that the rova and the motar flip places. And we explained that line, kind of how we explained it when we got to it in the Mishnah. And then we got to this other Mishnah about contradicting your words, and which we go by the first thing you said or the last thing. And we saw that ben nanas holds by whatever you said at the end must be what you meant. That's the end for today. Wishing everybody a meaningful day. We have 2 days this year to remember October 7th and on Simchat Torah. So this will be the beginning of this stage of reaching a year from when this all started. Wishing everyone a good day and a safe day.